They laughed when the janitor's son touched the rocket pump. But one sound, one chance, and NASA would never forget his name. Some children are born without a name waiting for them, without a welcome into the world. They grow like weeds in the cracks of sidewalks, quietly, unnoticed. But once in a while, from such soil, a single spark smolders, waiting for a breeze to catch and turn it into fire. That morning, the NASA cryogenics testing facility had opened its doors to a special group, elite engineering students from the top universities in the country. Polished shoes tapped across the cold concrete floor. Industrial lights poured down over brushed steel walls, where the dreams of flight and fire were tested, broken, and tested again. Not with fantasy, but with math, pressure, and patience. No one noticed the small boy standing near the edge of the security gate. He was 12, thin, dark-haired, with a sun-browned face and a coat that had seen too many winters. His shoes were threadbare, the soles nearly gone. In his hands, he held a weathered notebook, its spine stitched with red thread. His father's thread. His name was Elijah, and he did not have a badge. As the students passed through the scanner, Elijah stepped behind them, eyes wide with awe, looking at the rocket engine displays like a pilgrim peeking into a sacred place. But just a few steps in, a voice barked from behind a security desk. "This isn't for kids. No badge, no entry. Step back." Elijah stopped. He didn't argue. He simply nodded, stepped to the side, and sat down quietly near the wall, just beyond the reach of the warm lights. The door to the testing chamber shut with a heavy click, firm and final. Like so many doors before it. The school that turned him away, the library that wouldn't let him in without ID, the science fair that said, "This is only for regular students." His father, Reuben, was mopping the floor nearby. He watched it all. His back was bent from years of work and quiet pain. He saw his son stopped at the door. He said nothing. Between the whisper of machines and the hum of wires, their eyes met. It wasn't a look of anger. It was a quiet kind of sadness, one that had lived in both their bones for a long time. Elijah pulled out his notebook and sat down on the cool concrete floor, back against the wall. He flipped past the first few pages, pencil sketches of pipe layouts, hand-drawn diagrams of valves, scattered notes in uneven handwriting. On one page, a scrawl from long ago. "If the pump screams at startup, check the intake. Remember what Dad said, engines never lie. They only whisper." He added a line beneath it. "Not every door closes out of cruelty. Some close simply because no one thinks you'll understand what's inside." Inside the chamber, through the thick glass wall, the test lights flicked on. Engineers in jumpsuits surrounded the massive silver cryogenic pump, the heart of a liquid-fueled rocket engine. White fog poured from its pipes as liquid hydrogen moved through the cold veins of the system. Elijah leaned forward, squinting. Then he heard it. A sound, faint, thin, metal against metal. Almost like a whistle, high and sharp. It only lasted a second. No one inside seemed to notice. No one stopped. But Elijah noticed. He had heard that sound before. Back home, in the garage behind their trailer, when their irrigation pump shrieked just before breaking. He remembered his father opening the casing, shaking his head. "She's sucking in air through the line. That whistle's the sound of vapor bubbles, son. They eat blades for breakfast." Elijah placed his palm flat against the cool window glass. The sound echoed in his mind, one note but full of warning. He couldn't tell anyone. Who would listen? He was no one. Just a boy in a borrowed coat, with grease under his nails and no place on the clipboard. He wore no university crest. He had no mentor, no letter of recommendation. In a place where knowledge came with degrees and badges, no one would ask the janitor's son what he thought. Still, he opened his notebook and wrote, "The machine is whispering, and no one is listening." From behind him, Reuben approached, setting the mop aside, his knees cracking as he knelt next to his son. He didn't speak, just placed a calloused hand gently on the boy's shoulder. Two figures, one old, one young, sat pressed against the same wall, inches from a world that refused to see them. But between them, there was a notebook. And inside that notebook was a quiet kind of knowing, passed not through classrooms but through time, through oil-stained fingers, and through a belief both of them still carried, that listening is its own kind of intelligence. Elijah looked up. His eyes were no longer lost. He had heard something that no one else had. And even if no one believed him, that didn't make it any less real. Because genius doesn't always enter through the front door. Sometimes, it finds the cracks. The thing about machines, especially the old ones, is that they don't lie. They don't pretend. They don't flatter. If something is wrong, they'll tell you. Not with words, not with sirens, but with tiny sounds, subtle shifts, a small tremble here, a strange heat there. They whisper first. And Elijah had learned to listen. It was nearly 11 in the morning. The students from MIT and Georgia Tech were now gathered inside the observation room, laughing, pointing at the large display screens. The cryogenic pump had just completed its first ignition cycle. Engineers stood beside the glass with their arms folded, watching telemetry data flow in. Pressure curves, flow rates, temperature drops. Everything seemed normal, except one thing. To everyone else, it was background noise, a fleeting, high-pitched ring like wind slipping through a crack in the door. It came during the ramp-up phase of the pump, lasting just a second before the system stabilized. Too brief to alarm, too soft to measure. But to Elijah, it was the exact tone of something trying not to break. He had heard that sound before, not in textbooks or lectures, but in the fields behind their trailer park, in old farm pumps that screamed just before cavitation shattered their impellers. The garage had been their classroom, and the broken things their professors. He pressed his ear closer to the glass window. The pump was in standby now, humming gently, its pipes breathing out soft white clouds of vapor. But the sound remained in his mind, not just a memory, but a warning. He flipped open his notebook again, turned to a fresh page, and wrote, "Scream heard during ramp-up. Duration, 0.8 seconds. Frequency est, 3.2 kHz. Probable cause, incipient cavitation at inlet." Beside it, he drew a simple sketch. The inlet elbow of the pump, followed by a narrowing throat, and a shaded vortex forming just before the blade assembly. He remembered his father's words. Cavitation's not just noise, it's damage you can't see, until it's too late. Cavitation, a word that sounded poetic to Elijah. To others, it was an engineer's nightmare. It meant vapor bubbles forming inside a liquid stream when local pressure dropped too low. Those bubbles collapsed with force, hitting the pump walls like miniature hammers. In metal, it left pockmarks. In engines, it left ruin. And in cryogenic pumps, where liquid hydrogen flowed just above absolute zero, the risks were higher. Materials shrank. Clearances tightened. One misalignment, one bad angle, and vapor could form in a place where only liquid should exist. Elijah didn't have access to the design specs. He didn't know the pump's name or model number, but he knew the sound. From the corner of the room, Reuben glanced at his son, kneeling beside the wall, scribbling with quiet urgency. The father said nothing. He knew that look, not of boredom, not of mischief, but of fierce attention. That was how Elijah had always been. Never loud, never angry. Just listening, always listening. Inside the test chamber, A voice echoed through the intercom. "Stand by for second cycle. Increasing throttle ramp rate to 60%. All eyes on telemetry." The pump whirred back to life. Valves clicked open. Pressurized lines hissed. The stainless steel casing began to hum again. And then, there it was. Not a squeal, not a screech, but a scream, brief and rising, like metal gasping, like a warning exhale from something too cold to cry. The engineers kept their eyes on the data. Nothing spiked. No alarms went off. No pressure drop large enough to cause concern. And yet Elia stood up. He walked toward the glass wall. A technician noticed him and frowned. "You again? Kid, you need to back off. This isn't your place." Elia hesitated. He could feel it. The pressure to shrink, to stay small, to stay silent. Every instinct told him to sit down again, to wait, to be good. But something in his chest pulsed louder than the warning. He took a breath and spoke, not loud but clear. "Sir, that pump is cavitating." The room fell quiet. The technician blinked. "What did you say?" "There's a scream during ramp-up," Elia said. "It's cavitation. I think the NPSH is too low." A group of interns turned toward him, confused. One snickered. Another leaned in and whispered, "What's NPSH?" The technician folded his arms. "Boy, that's a serious claim. You shouldn't throw around terms like that." But Elia didn't flinch. "I'm not throwing them around. I'm listening." A laugh burst from the other side of the room. A tall man with silver hair, thick glasses, and a clipboard under his arm stepped forward. Dr. Mallory, a retired professor who now served as an advisor at the testing facility. "Young man," he said, "do you even know what cavitation means?" "Yes, sir." "And what exactly do you think you heard?" "The sound of vapor collapsing," Elia answered. "About 0.8 seconds after initial flow, the inlet elbows forming a vortex. And if the aluminum housing is contracting unevenly, then there's clearance mismatch between the casing and the rotor. That means the flow path is disturbed." The professor raised an eyebrow. "Elbow-induced vortex," Elia added. "It drops the local pressure enough to flash the liquid into vapor. The pump screams because it's hurting. It's telling you something." Mallory's smirk faltered. For a moment, the only sound in the room was the soft venting of hydrogen vapor. Then the professor cleared his throat. "Fine. If you're so sure," he said slowly, "then tell me this. If that pump is screaming, what would you do to make it stop?" Elia looked down at his notebook, then back up. "I'd raise the static head by about 20 centimeters to stabilize inlet pressure. Add a bleed valve to release trapped air at the elbow, and I'd slow down the motor's ramp-up, soften the pressure gradient." Mallory paused. His lips pressed into a line. He looked at the technician, then at the students, then finally at the pump behind the glass. "Let's see if the kid's right." There's a peculiar silence that fills a room right before someone gets laughed at. It's not the loud silence of tension, but something softer, like the pause before a violin string snaps. And Elia stood in the middle of it. He wasn't supposed to be there. A child. No badge, no background. Yet here he was, standing in front of 30 engineers, interns, and students from the nation's best schools, calmly talking about cavitation like it was breakfast talk. It had started quietly, but now the whispers were turning to smirks. From the far end of the room, one of the older interns, tall, neat hair, MIT jacket zipped all the way up, leaned back against a rail and chuckled. "Did he just say NPSH like he knows what it is?" Another chimed in. "Didn't know they covered fluid dynamics in janitor school." Someone laughed louder than the rest, the kind of laugh that cuts not because it's cruel, but because it confirms what the others are thinking. Elia didn't flinch. His hands were steady at his sides, notebook still open. The lead technician, Mr. Farrell, folded his arms tightly across his chest and raised his chin. His voice rang sharp in the room. "All right, that's enough. You've made your little speech, son. Go sit down before someone gets hurt, and I don't mean the pump." Elijah looked up at the glass, where the cryogenic pump still sat, idle now, mist curling around its base. He didn't respond to Farrell. He didn't move. That was when the professor stepped in. Dr. Mallory, arms behind his back, approached with slow, deliberate steps. He had taught at Caltech for nearly 4 decades, the kind of man who didn't raise his voice because the weight of his words did it for him. "Gentlemen," he said, "let's not be too quick to dismiss curiosity." The interns fell silent. He turned to Elijah. "So, you believe the pump is cavitating, and you believe you know why?" "Yes, sir," Elijah replied. Mallory nodded. "And where exactly did you learn this?" There was a longer pause this time. Elijah didn't answer at once. His eyes dropped to the floor, then to the side, where his father stood, mop in hand, face half-shadowed. "In our garage," Elijah said at last. "Back home. We fix old farm pumps." Another laugh came from the group, this one involuntary. Surprised, like someone snorted without meaning to. Mallory raised a hand and the room fell still again. "I see," he said quietly. "You've never been in a formal lab." "No, sir." "No fluid mechanics course?" "No." Mallory walked to the whiteboard on the side of the room and uncapped a marker. In firm strokes, he wrote a question. "Why does cavitation occur during ramp-up?" Then he turned back. "If you can answer that," he said, "right here, right now, I'll apologize. Publicly. And I'll listen to whatever else you have to say." It was no longer a conversation. It was a challenge. Elijah stepped forward slowly. Every step echoed on the concrete floor. He stood barely chest-high to the other men in the room, but there was something in his stance, a calmness that didn't match his age. He looked at the board, then at the room, and then softly he began. "When the motor ramps up, the pump spins faster than the fluid can stabilize, duh. If the inlet isn't pressurized enough, the local pressure drops." He took the marker in small hands, drew a simple curve under Mallory's question, a descending line, labeled local pressure. Then he drew a dotted line beneath it, labeled vapor pressure. If the local pressure dips below the vapor pressure of the fluid, it flashes, becomes vapor. His hand didn't shake. "These vapor bubbles form near the blade tips. When pressure recovers downstream, they collapse. Fast. And violently." He capped the marker. "That's cavitation." Silence. Mallory said nothing. He just looked at the board, then back at the boy. Behind them, one of the interns muttered, "That's not wrong." The room shifted, eyebrows lifted. No one laughed now. Mallory finally exhaled. "Well," he said, rubbing his jaw, "I suppose I owe you an apology." But before he could say more, Farrell stepped forward. "Hold on," the technician said, his voice tight. "You can't just take advice from a kid with a pencil in a garage. This is a multi-million-dollar system. We're not running tests on some rusty farm pump." Elijah turned to him. His voice was quiet, but steady. "The laws of physics don't change because the room is cleaner." Farrell stared at him. And for a second, even he didn't have a comeback. Mallory looked at Elijah, eyes thoughtful. "You said it screams. How long before it breaks?" Elijah paused. "If that sound is cavitation," he said, "and if the clearance is mismatched from thermal contraction, then the impeller could shatter in 30 seconds. Maybe less." More silence. Mallory turned to the room. Well, I suppose we'd be fools not to check. And with that, the boy who was never supposed to be there, the janitor's son in worn-out shoes, had said something that froze an entire lab. A machine had whispered, and someone at last had listened. It's a strange thing, the way silence changes. At first, it had been the silence of dismissal, the kind people use when they've already decided someone doesn't matter. Now, it was the silence of attention. Real attention. And Elia felt it like a heat on the back of his neck. Dr. Mallory stood beside the whiteboard, still holding the marker cap between his fingers, like a judge weighing a verdict. On the board behind him, a child's diagram, pressure curves and all, so simple it looked like something from a high school notebook. Yet no one had erased it. Farrell, the lead technician, leaned against a railing, arms crossed tight, jaw clenched. He hadn't said anything since Elia mentioned a potential housing mismatch, a problem that could mean the pump was on the verge of catastrophic failure. His silence now wasn't patience. It was resistance. The interns, once amused, had stopped chuckling. A few of them had even pulled out their tablets, looking up the specs of the pump they'd assumed they knew inside out. And there it was, buried in a data sheet, the alloy used in the pump housing, aluminum-titanium blend, known for high strength at low weight, but susceptible to uneven contraction at cryogenic temperatures. Exactly what Elia had said. Mallory tapped his fingers on the railing once, then spoke. "All right," he said, not to Elia, but to the room. "We've heard a theory. Now, I'm curious. Can we put it to the test?" Farrell bristled. "This isn't a high school science fair, Professor. We're dealing with hydrogen at minus 400 degrees. You want to reroute the test protocol based on a hunch from a boy?" "It's not a hunch," Mallory replied calmly. "It's an observation. And that's how good engineering begins." Elia said nothing. He just stood there, notebook in hand, heart thudding quietly beneath his coat. He hadn't come here to speak. He had only meant to listen. But the machine had whispered, and he'd understood. Mallory turned back to him. "You said the pump screams during ramp-up. If you can explain exactly why that happens, not just guess, but explain. I'll have this whole lab acknowledge your findings." His voice lowered so only Elia could hear. "And I'll make sure you're never shut out of a room like this again." Elia looked up. There were 36 eyes on him. He was 12. He had no badge, no institution behind him. Only his father's garage, his own ears, and a pencil that had been sharpened down to the wood. But he nodded. "Okay," he said. "I'll try." He stepped forward, slowly. Not onto a stage. There was no platform here, but into the center of the lab floor, between screens and cables and engineers with PhDs. The mist from the cryogenic system curled behind him like breath in winter. He looked at the whiteboard, still smudged with his drawing. Then he spoke. "When the pump starts, the flow doesn't instantly stabilize. The motor spins up, but the liquid takes a moment to catch up. During that moment, pressure at the inlet elbow drops." He walked to the diagram, pointed at the elbow. "This corner creates a vortex. It's not in the design, it's a side effect. That vortex lowers the local pressure even more. And if it drops below vapor pressure, even by a little..." He drew a small circle in the inlet line. "Bubbles form, vapor, not liquid. But when the pump finishes ramping up and pressure catches up," he tapped downstream on the line. "Those bubbles collapse. Fast. Violently." He looked up. "That collapse is the scream." No one spoke. Elia continued, now more quietly. "And if the housing around the rotor has contracted, from the cold, It changes the gap between the rotor and the casing. That makes the flow path uneven. Some parts get more pressure, some less. The imbalance makes the cavitation worse. He closed his notebook. It's not a problem in the motor. It's not a bug in the code. The pump is working, but it's hurting. Mallory stared at him, then slowly turned back to the team. Well, he asked, does it match what we've seen? One of the interns, a girl in a Stanford hoodie, looked up from her screen. Actually, the numbers check out, she said. And I reran the flow simulation just now. There is a pressure drop at the elbow during ramp-up, exactly where he said. Mallory nodded. Thank you. Then, facing the room once more, his voice calm but firm. Ladies and gentlemen, unless anyone here can give me a better explanation, I believe we've just been corrected. By a boy in second-hand shoes. There was a long, heavy pause. Then, slowly, like the reluctant applause after a difficult concert, someone clapped. Then another, and another. And in the corner, Reuben, still holding his mop, still half hidden in the shadow of the control console, watched his son stand tall in a place no one expected him to belong. For the first time in his life, Elijah did not feel small. He had not demanded respect. He had not forced his way in. He had simply listened, understood, and spoke the truth. And the truth, no matter who says it, has a way of silencing rooms. Not everything in engineering is about equations. Some problems reveal themselves not through models or simulations, but in how they sound, how they breathe. Elijah understood that. Not because he'd read it in a textbook, but because he had watched machines the way others watched people. He knew when a motor stuttered not from power loss, but fear. And he knew that sometimes the only thing a machine needed was someone willing to be still long enough to listen. So when Dr. Mallory said, "Go ahead," the room expected the boy to rush in, point to something, make a child's guess, and hope for luck. But Elijah did none of that. He didn't speak. He didn't even step forward. Instead, he walked a wide, deliberate circle around the massive cryogenic pump. He moved slowly, not nervously but with quiet care, like someone circling a horse he didn't want to startle. He didn't touch anything. He didn't need to. To those watching, the scene was almost comical. A 12-year-old in an oversized coat walking around a $40 million piece of machinery as if inspecting a lawnmower in his backyard. But to Mallory, something about the boy's stillness was familiar. It reminded him of the old days, watching his mentor walk around a wind tunnel for 30 silent minutes before pointing to a single cracked bolt. Reuben watched too. From behind the supply cart, his hand tight around the mop handle, he didn't blink. Elijah stopped now and then, closing his eyes, tilting his head. He knelt once near the intake piping, where the frost line was thinner, an unusual thermal pattern. He stood again, listened. The hum of coolant pumps in the distance. The faint hiss of vapor bleeding from a relief valve, all part of the background. But there, just once, a flutter. A note out of place. A tiny pulse in the aluminum shell, too quick for sensors, too subtle for engineers watching graphs. Elijah pulled out his pencil and made 3 notes in the back of his notebook. NPSH too low at 3.7 SEC, thermal contraction mismatch near housing throat, inlet elbow-inducing asymmetrical vortex. The pencil lead snapped from pressure. He didn't notice. He stood again and faced the group. Mallory, still watching from the edge, spoke softly. Well, what did you find? Elijah opened his notebook. There's a problem at the elbow, he said. The pipe curve is too sharp. It pulls liquid unevenly into the impeller. That creates a swirling pocket, a vortex. He turned the page, showing a simple top-down sketch of the inlet. It drops the local pressure just before the rotor blades. That's where cavitation starts. One of the interns stepped forward. But we ran the simulations. There was no vortex in the model. Elia nodded. In the model, the fluid was ideal. No trapped air, no slight tilt in the base, no microscopic warp in the casing. Real systems aren't perfect. Mallory's eyebrows lifted slightly. Go on, he said. Elia continued. And the housing is aluminum-titanium blend. When it gets cold, hydrogen cold, it contracts more than the steel rotor. That makes the gap tighter on one side. He turned another page, a drawing of a rotor inside a housing with an exaggerated tilt. Now the blade clearance is uneven. Flow pressure changes inside the cavity. Combine that with the vortex, and the inlet pressure drops below vapor point. He tapped his notes. That's the scream. Silence again. A younger engineer leaned in. How do you know that? Elia didn't smile. He just said simply, because we had a pump like this in our farm. Not this big, but it screamed the same way. My dad said, engines don't lie. They whisper. For the first time, no one laughed. Reuben, still in the back, closed his eyes. Not from pride, but from something deeper. The quiet recognition that years of hard labor, of making do with what they had somehow prepared his son to stand in this room. Mallory folded his arms. What would you do to fix it? Elia flipped to a clean page. 3 things, he said. 1. Increase the static head by 20 centimeters, more pressure at the inlet. 2. Add a small air bleed at the elbow. Let the vortex break. 3. Adjust the ramp-up curve on the motor controller. Slower acceleration means lower pressure gradient. The boy looked up. That should stop the scream. A beat passed. Mallory looked at the team. Can we simulate that? An engineer nodded. Yes, sir. Give me 10 minutes. Another said, we can test the ramp-up curve change with the current software. It's just a parameter file. Farrell, silent until now, muttered, this is absurd. But he didn't stop them, because deep down, he'd heard the scream too. Before there were rocket pumps and cryogenic chambers, before the white coats and the blinking telemetry screens, there was a garage. The kind with peeling green paint on the door, rust in the hinges, and the smell of old oil baked into the floor like memory. A single light bulb hung from a frayed cord, casting more shadow than light. In the winter, the concrete was so cold it made your knees ache. In summer, the walls held in heat like a tin can on fire. It was not much, but it was everything Elia had. Back then, he was 7, small even for his age, with hands too soft to hold a wrench, but eyes that never blinked when machines were talking. And Reuben, his father, taught him not with lectures, but with silence. He never said, this is how fluid dynamics works, or let me show you the Bernoulli principle. Instead, he'd kneel beside an old irrigation pump, gesture for Elia to come closer, and say one thing. Listen. On one of those days, the pump had been wheezing. A choked, high-pitched sound. Not broken, but not right. Reuben unscrewed the top casing slowly, with the tired rhythm of a man who'd done it 100 times. Elia had stood nearby, notebook in hand. Even then, he kept notes, watching his father's every move. Reuben tapped the side of the casing with a wrench. A faint clink. Feel that? He asked. Elia blinked. It feels hollow. His father nodded. She's sucking in air. Somewhere near the intake line. Probably a hairline crack or the water level's too low. He leaned back, wiped sweat from his forehead with a rag tied around his wrist. You know what that sound is, Eli? The scream? Elia guessed. Reuben chuckled. Not a scream. Not yet. Right now it's a whisper. A warning. He tightened the bolts again, but not before reaching under the intake pipe and raising the water level in the barrel by stacking a few bricks under the basin. Then he restarted the pump. This time it ran quieter. Not silent, but smoother, like it had taken a deep breath. Elia was silent, absorbing, listening. That, Reuben said, is called giving her enough head pressure. When you don't, the pressure drops too low and vapor bubbles form. They hit the blades like little hammers. You won't hear them at first, but they'll eat the rotor alive if you don't listen. Elia wrote it down word for word. He didn't know then that his father had never finished high school, that he had learned everything by trial and error, bruised knuckles and broken machines. But in that garage, with nothing but tools, time, and care, his father was the closest thing to a professor he'd ever known. And machines, Elia realized, respected those who respected them. He remembered another day. The rain had leaked through the roof, and they were trying to dry the motor casing with an old towel. Reuben had squatted beside a little turbine fan and said, "Engines don't lie, Eli. They don't hide things. But they don't shout either. They whisper. They hum. They change tone. If you rush, you'll miss it." Elia had nodded slowly. "Like people," he'd whispered back. Reuben looked at him then, really looked. And for a moment, something in his eyes broke open. "Yeah," he said. "Exactly like people." Back in the present, Elia stood quietly beside the cryogenic pump in the NASA lab. Same hum, same frost. Just colder now, and the stakes much higher. But the principles were unchanged. He glanced down at the metal housing. Frost lined the inlet elbow. The temperature was hovering just above -400 degrees Fahrenheit, hydrogen cold. But he wasn't thinking about temperature. He was thinking about tone. And just like in the garage, years ago, the machine was whispering. Not failing. Not yet. But asking. Behind him, someone adjusted a screen. Farrell barked an update into a comms headset. The control team worked to reprogram the ramp-up curve. Elia stayed still. Then, from the corner, a voice approached. "Dr. Mallory." "You learned all this from a garage?" Elia nodded. Mallory looked at the boy, not with disbelief, but with something like respect. "I spent 12 years in lecture halls," the professor said softly, "and I forgot what it meant to observe." Elia shrugged. "You don't forget. You just stop being quiet long enough to hear things." Mallory smiled, not wide, but genuine. Farther away, Reuben stood near the back door of the lab. He didn't move closer. He didn't need to. The boy standing beside the machine, calm, focused, brave, was his son. But in this moment, he also saw the boy he used to be. Curious, unsure, hands covered in grease, listening to a machine no one else understood. And now, his son had carried that same gift, that quiet skill, into a place where it mattered, where it could make a difference, where it could stop something from breaking. Some answers arrive like thunder, loud, undeniable, impossible to miss. Others come as a whisper, so soft, so careful, that the room must grow quiet just to hear them. Elia's answer belonged to the second kind. The room was full now. Engineers had returned from lunch. A few researchers from other wings had gathered too, curious about the growing noise surrounding the boy with the notebook. Word travels quickly in places like this. "The janitor's kid said the pump's gonna break." Mallory's backing him. Something about thermal contraction? They didn't say his name, only who he belonged to. Still, Elia stood. Not at the podium. There wasn't one. Just a small space near the diagnostics screen, where the light from the cryogenic unit spilled across the floor like mist. He clutched his notebook, opened to a page near the back, smudged with graphite and oil stains from his father's garage. Across from him, Dr. Mallory gave a single nod. "You may explain, Elijah. Speak slowly, and don't worry if your words tremble. The truth doesn't mind shaking hands." Elijah glanced at the room. Too many eyes, too many uniforms. He didn't know what to do with his hands. His throat felt dry. But he remembered something. The pump didn't care about nerves. It didn't care about degrees or credentials. It only cared if you listened. So he took a breath and began. "At startup," he said, "the motor begins to accelerate, but the flow of liquid hydrogen lags behind. That delay creates a temporary drop in pressure at the inlet elbow." He turned his notebook around, revealing a sketch, simple, hand-drawn, of the pump's inlet path. A curve, a narrow throat. Pressure arrows drawn in pencil. That elbow forms a vortex. It's small, but it spins just enough to pull the pressure lower. Lower than the vapor pressure of the hydrogen. He paused, swallowing. Then the fluid flashes. A murmur moved through the room. One of the interns frowned. "Flashes?" Dr. Mallory clarified gently. "Turns to vapor." Elijah nodded. "Yes. The hydrogen flashes into vapor, just for a moment, and bubbles form near the rotor blades. They collapse downstream. That collapse is violent. It's not loud on the sensors, but you can hear it." He tapped the diagram softly. "That's the scream." A whisper, then silence. It wasn't a long explanation. It wasn't dramatic. But something in the way Elijah spoke, slow, quiet, untrained but certain, made the words land harder than if they'd come from any professor. Farrell stepped forward, skeptical as ever. "That still doesn't explain why it just started. We've run this test before. Same pump, same setup. Why now?" Elijah looked at him. Not defiantly, not afraid, just honestly. "Because it's colder this week," he said. "Your ambient temperature dropped. That made the hydrogen colder. And the colder it gets, the more the aluminum housing shrinks." He flipped to another page, a diagram showing the rotor and the housing casing. "The rotor is stainless steel, but the housing is aluminum alloy. They contract differently." He pointed. "This mismatch changes the clearance, the tiny gap where the fluid moves. Now the flow path shifts just enough to make the vortex stronger. That's what caused the cavitation, not the design, the condition." Someone in the back whispered, "Holy hell." A young engineer typed rapidly, pulling up thermal contraction tables. Another ran a script re-simulating clearance shrinkage at lower temperatures. One by one, heads nodded. It checked out. Mallory looked at Farrell. "Well?" Farrell didn't speak. His face wasn't angry. It was tired. Like a man forced to admit he hadn't heard something important because he'd been too busy talking. He muttered, "I'll check the logbooks. We didn't account for ambient delta this week." Then he stepped back. Elijah's hands were shaking now, just a little. He clutched the notebook tighter. Mallory stepped beside him, laying a hand on his shoulder. "You said earlier," the professor said, "that the machine was whispering." Elijah nodded. "Yes, it wasn't failing yet, but it was warning." Mallory looked at the room. "That warning just saved a $40 million pump. And maybe more." Then, turning back to the boy, he added, "And for what it's worth, I've been teaching thermofluids for 40 years. I've never seen anyone explain cavitation that simply." A moment passed, then another. And someone, no one could later remember who, began to clap. Not politely. Not awkwardly, but slowly, respectfully. A few others followed, and then, across the room, a sound rose that Elijah had never heard in his direction before. Applause, not because he was special, not because he was lucky, but because he was right. Reuben, still half hidden near the mop sink, wiped at his eyes. Years of working in the shadows, of being treated like furniture in the rooms he cleaned, had never prepared him for this moment. His son, whose only classroom had been a leaking garage. His son, whose hands had never touched a keyboard that wasn't secondhand. His son, now being listened to by people who had once looked through him. And in that moment, Reuben didn't care if anyone knew his name, because they knew his boys. Every great machine has a moment of decision, the moment before ignition, before the lever is pulled, before someone says, "Let's try it." For NASA, that moment had come. And the one proposing the change was a janitor's son. The applause from the last session still lingered in the room like smoke after a fire. But now came the part engineers feared most. Not the theory, not the diagrams, but the doing. Dr. Mallory stood beside Elijah, flipping through the boy's notes with a kind of reverence, like reading something half between a field manual and a prayer. Across the lab, Farrell leaned against a console, jaw tight. The diagnostics screen showed a clean profile, no failures, no red lights, but also no guarantee that the cavitation wouldn't return. Mallory turned to Elijah. "You said you had a fix." "I do," the boy answered quietly. "And you're sure?" "As sure as I was about the scream." The room held its breath. Elijah stepped forward. He spoke with no theatrics, just a kind of quiet urgency, like someone sharing instructions for how to stop a wound from bleeding. "There are 3 problems," he began. "Each needs one fix." He raised his hand and began counting with his fingers. 1. The inlet pressure is too low during ramp-up. Solution? Raise the static head by 20 centimeters. Add liquid to the intake reservoir. That gives the pump more positive pressure before spin-up. A technician frowned. "That's simple enough, but that tank's calibrated." "Calibration won't matter if the blades shatter," Elijah replied softly. He continued. 2. There's trapped gas in the inlet elbow. It's feeding the vortex. Add a bleed valve at the top curve. Let it purge air before startup. Silence again. The simplicity of it made it harder to argue with. 3rd, Elijah said, your motor ramp-up profile is too steep. The acceleration creates a sharp pressure gradient. It doesn't give the fluid time to settle. He paused. Flatten the curve. Make the pressure increase slower, even if it delays ignition by a few seconds. Farrell finally stepped forward. You're asking us to rewrite the startup sequence, based on one test? I'm asking you to stop the screaming, Elijah said. Just once. Try it once. Mallory turned to the team. Can we simulate the adjusted profile? A young systems engineer nodded. Already done. If we use a Type B soft start algorithm instead of Type A, the ramp time goes from 3 seconds to 6. That smooths the delta P curve by nearly 40%. And the static head adjustment? Adding 20 centimeters raises inlet pressure by about 0.2 bar, enough to prevent vapor formation, even with housing contraction. Farrell crossed his arms. And the bleed valve? The mechanical lead, who hadn't said a word until now, finally nodded. It'll take me 5 minutes with a portable rig. I'll pull from the high-point vent manifold. Mallory glanced around. No more arguments. No more disbelief. Just engineers, real ones, solving a real problem, guided not by rank, but by reason. Preparations began. Elijah stood aside as teams moved like clockwork. recalibrating the intake tank, changing the ramp code, installing the temporary bleed line. And through it all, Reuben watched from the same corner, still holding the mop, still invisible, but standing taller now. Someone had given his son a chance. That was enough. The test chamber lights dimmed. Warning strobes blinked red. A voice came over the intercom. Cryo pump test, sequence revision 1 based on observer protocol, initiating in T-minus 30 seconds. Observer protocol. That's what they called it now. Not the boy's idea, not garage theory, but a legitimate procedure. Recorded, time-stamped, and executed under NASA protocol. Mallory leaned close to Elia. This is your window, son. If the scream's gone, you'll have done something no one else here could. Elia said nothing. He just held his notebook to his chest and nodded. T-minus 10. The mist began to rise again. T-minus 5. Motors hummed. Lights flickered. Ignition. The pump spun up, slower this time, smoother, like it had taken a breath and decided to trust the hands guiding it. Everyone leaned in. Elia closed his eyes. Then, nothing. No scream, no flutter, no ghostly whine of a machine in pain, just a low, steady roar, stable, full, complete. A green light blinked on the screen, then a second. Then 5 more. System normal. Pressure stable. No anomalies detected. No one spoke. It wasn't shock. It wasn't pride. It was something deeper. The kind of reverence engineers feel when a thing that should have broken decides to hold together. Mallory turned to Elia. Well, he asked, do you hear anything? Elia listened, then shook his head. It's quiet, he whispered. She's okay now. And in that room, that lab of blinking lights and compressed gases, it wasn't the silence of failure anymore. It was the silence of understanding, of listening, of believing, not in machines, but in a boy. It was quiet, not the kind of quiet that follows failure, but the kind that comes when something broken has been made whole. The pump, the same one that had screamed just hours before, now pulsed with a clean, cold rhythm, like breath after pain, like a song returning to key. Green lights lined the diagnostics panel, pressure levels held, no spikes, no cavitation. The data confirmed what the ear already knew. She wasn't screaming anymore. And yet no one moved. It was as if the room, the engineers, the students, the visitors, had all forgotten how to speak. Even the control team, buried behind screens and code, sat frozen. One of them whispered half to himself, I've never seen numbers that clean. But the real confirmation wasn't digital. It was in the silence. A silence earned, not given. Elia stood still. His shoulders were tight, his fingers clenched around the edge of his coat. He had not moved since the final green light came on. He didn't smile. He didn't celebrate. He just listened. One more time. No scream, no flutter, no whisper of failure. Just the low, steady hum of a machine finally at peace. Then, quietly, he closed his notebook. Dr. Mallory stepped forward. He moved slowly, as if each step needed to match the gravity of the moment. In his hands, he held nothing. No report, no laptop, just his voice. He turned to the team, technicians, engineers, interns, visitors, then to Elia, and finally to the father in the corner. Reuben, still holding the mop, still watching from behind the caution line, as if afraid someone might ask him to leave. Mallory spoke. I've spent my life teaching thermodynamics. I've read thousands of pages, taught thousands of students, but in all my years, I've never learned more in one afternoon than I did today. He looked at Elia. You didn't just fix the pump, son. You listened to it. You understood it. And more than that, you made us listen too. No one breathed. Mallory took one more step. He looked down at Elia, not down in status, but down in height, and extended his hand. I was wrong about you. About where knowledge comes from. And I'm sorry. Elia's lips parted, but no words came. Just a small, breathless sound, like someone who hadn't expected to be seen, finally being called by name. The boy reached out and shook his hand. The room remained quiet, not because it didn't care, but because something sacred had just happened. And sacred things are not clapped for. They are witnessed. Then, someone broke protocol. One of the senior engineers stepped out from the console, walked over to Elia and held up a printed schematic. Hey, he said, smiling. Would you take a look at this clearance zone? I think we missed something else. Laughter rippled through the lab. Light, easy. And just like that, the mood shifted. Tension gave way to welcome. Skepticism melted into respect. They weren't looking at the janitor's son anymore. They were looking at a peer. A small click echoed through the chamber. Farrell, the lead technician, had quietly approached from the side, his expression unreadable. He stared at Elia for a long moment, then said, not loud, not soft, I didn't believe you. I judged too fast. Elia looked up. Farrell nodded toward the pump. But I'll never forget the day it went silent, and I'll never forget who made it happen. At that moment, Mallory turned toward the control room and gave a signal. Let's enter him in the record, he said. Observer student. Status, present at time of successful anomaly resolution. A junior technician hesitated. But he's not enrolled anywhere. Mallory's voice didn't change. Doesn't matter. The pump listened to him. That's credential enough. He looked at Reuben now, and for the first time all day addressed him directly. Sir, he said, would you like to join us? I believe you've raised someone extraordinary. Reuben froze. He looked down at his hands, rough, dry, calloused from years of bleach. Chemicals, metal? Hands not used to being shaken. Hands no one ever asked to join anything. But then he looked at his son, and something inside him, long hidden, long silenced, moved. He stepped forward, across the line, past the caution sign, into the light. And for the first time in his life, the janitor stood not beside the machine, but with the team. Elia turned to his father and smiled, small, quiet, but full of years of meaning. And Reuben, voice rough with disbelief, whispered, You did it, Eli. No, Elia replied. We did. In the end, no ceremony was held. No press release was written. The world didn't stop. But somewhere deep inside NASA's test archives, in the logbooks of the day's trial, a line was quietly added. Observation anomaly resolved. Cause: cavitation from thermal mismatch and inlet vortex. Resolution proposed by observer student Elia R., son of janitor Reuben R. And that was enough. By evening, the lab lights had dimmed. The monitors, once flickering with live data, now rested on idle screensavers. The roar of the pump was long gone, replaced by the soft, almost reverent silence of a room that had been changed. Most of the crowd had cleared. Some interns stayed behind, whispering in small groups. One had already nicknamed it the day the pump went quiet. It would become a kind of lab folklore, passed down from technician to technician, the story of the janitor's son, the cryogenic scream, and the silence that followed. But for Elia, that wasn't what mattered. He sat on the edge of a low steel platform, knees pulled up, notebook resting on his lap. Around him, mist still lingered near the base of the pipes. The cold didn't bother him. He was thinking, not about victory, but about what to leave behind. Reuben stood nearby, leaning against a crate of coiled cables. His mop, the same one he'd used for nearly 6 years, had been quietly left in the corner. No one asked him to pick it up again. He was no longer invisible. One of the younger engineers had even offered him coffee, but Reuben didn't care about the coffee or the handshake. He was watching his boy, the same boy who once held a broken fan motor like a wounded bird, who had stayed up late drawing rotor blades with crayons, who had asked at age 9, "Do machines feel lonely when no one listens to them?" Now that boy had made NASA listen, and he did it not by proving others wrong, but by being kind to a machine no one understood. Mallory returned quietly, holding a clipboard. Not because it was needed, but because old habits are hard to break. He walked up to Elia. "We're closing down the chamber tonight," he said gently. "Systems safe. Final logs are archived." Elia nodded. Mallory hesitated, then asked, "Would you like to write something in the final entry? Just a sentence. Doesn't have to be technical." Elia looked down at his notebook, thumbed through the worn pages, then tore one out. He stood, walked over to the control desk, and slid the page into the log binder. No speech, no attention. But when Mallory opened it, this is what he read. "Machines remember kindness." Just that. 3 words. Pencil on paper. The kind of sentence that doesn't need equations. Because its math is already written in how things break and how they heal. Later that night, a small gathering formed. Informal, just a few people from the team, standing near the break room with paper cups and tired smiles. Someone suggested they say a few words. Not about the pump, but about Reuben, the man who showed up every day before sunrise, who patched the roof with his own hands when it leaked, who stayed late without being asked, who taught his son the sound of vapor and the silence of understanding. Mallory stepped forward once more, now speaking not as a professor, but as a peer. "There are many kinds of teachers," he said. "Some teach from a podium, others from a garage floor." He raised his cup slightly toward Reuben. "I think we all know who taught the most important lesson today." For the first time, Reuben spoke. Not much. Just a few words, soft as worn leather. "I just raised a boy who knew how to listen." He did the rest. Before leaving, Elia walked one last time along the circle around the pump. He didn't say goodbye to the machine. Machines don't need goodbye. He just touched the housing with his palm, gently like a friend, and whispered, "She's listening now." Outside, the sky above the facility was dark but clear. Stars stretched in every direction, cold, ancient, and watching. Elia looked up. He didn't dream of being famous. He didn't imagine medals or universities. He just thought of a classroom, not with walls or degrees, but one made of oil stains, old bolts, and a father who taught him to hear the difference between failure and warning. He reached into his coat and slid the notebook, now missing its final page, back into his pocket. Then he took his father's hand, and together they walked into the dark, toward home, toward a future still unwritten, but no longer uninvited. In the months that followed, NASA quietly kept Elia on file as an observer technician. He was never paid, never promoted. But any time a pump made a sound no one could explain, someone would flip to the logbook, find his note, and remember the boy who listened when no one else did. If this story reminded you of someone, a quiet child, a parent who taught with their hands, or a time when you yourself were overlooked, share it. Because somewhere out there, another machine is whispering, and someone needs the courage to listen. Comment if you've ever fixed something, not just with knowledge, but with love. Let's keep these stories alive, for the sons who observe and the fathers who never needed a title to be a teacher.